Nobody in Harlem called him by his first name. Not the shopkeepers on 125th with Lenox, not the shoeshine boys who cleaned shoes on the corner by the Teresa Pharmacy, not the men who played dominoes under the red awnings of the Dakota Building. Nobody. They simply called him the Godson. And that was enough. In Harlem in 1968, that title was worth more than any Italian surname carved in marble. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, with a fork in his hand, sitting in a restaurant chair, surrounded by friends, exactly as he had lived, on his own terms. He left behind a legend, a debt to the city he could never repay, and a 19-year-old boy named Calvin Reeves, son of no one, raised by everyone, and protected by the most respected man Harlem had produced in 50 years. Calvin was 9 years old when Bumpy found him sleeping in the doorway of a dry cleaner's on 118th Street, wrapped in newspapers with broken shoes and a burn mark on his left forearm that nobody ever explained. Bumpy didn't ask where he came from. He didn't ask anything. He bought the boy a plate of hot food, listened to him eat in silence, and when he finished, told him only one thing. Starting today, this is your neighborhood. You'd better get to know it well. Calvin got to know it well. He got to know it better than anyone. For 10 years, Bumpy taught him everything he knew. Not just the business, not just the streets, not just the unwritten rules that kept a black man alive in a city that preferred to see him dead. He taught him to read people, to listen to what isn't said, to walk into a room and see in 3 seconds who was afraid, who had power, and who was pretending to have both. Calvin learned every lesson. He learned them so well that Bumpy ended up telling him 3 weeks before he died, "You see what I see. Nobody can take that away from you, but the dead cannot protect anyone." And in August 1968, with Bumpy in the ground, the vacuum he left began to be filled by Italian hands. The Caruso family had been looking at Harlem like unfinished business for 30 years. Don Aldo Caruso, 71 years old, Sicilian by birth and New Yorker by convenience, controlled the illegal numbers traffic in the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn. Harlem was the only thing missing from his map, and the only thing that had kept his hand from reaching there was the name Bumpy Johnson. With Bumpy dead, the map could be completed. Don Aldo sent his nephew to Harlem, Sal Caruso, 43 years old, 110 kilos, beige suit, ring on every finger. A man who had learned that fear was more efficient than negotiation and that contempt was cheaper than respect. Sal arrived in Harlem on August 14th with 2 bodyguards and a conviction that without Bumpy, Harlem was no man's land, that the men who remained were merchandise, that the Godson was exactly what he appeared to be, an orphan boy with no one to back him up. He was wrong on all 3 counts. It took him 48 hours to understand it. The encounter took place in the Teresa Building, the old hotel where Malcolm X had set up his offices, where Castro had slept, where Harlem kept part of its dignity in every crack in the walls. Sal Caruso had a meeting with 3 of the neighborhood's most important numbers operators, men who had worked under Bumpy's protection for years. Calvin was there because Calvin was always there, not invited, not announced, simply present, as he had been for 10 years, learning from the corners what others only saw from the center. The meeting went badly from the start. Sal spoke like someone buying horses at a fair, with prices in his mouth and disdain in his eyes. The operators listened in silence, the kind of silence that precedes a decision that has not yet been spoken aloud. Calvin was leaning against the back wall of the room, arms crossed, watching. He watched the way Sal moved his hands when he spoke, too wide, too theatrical. He watched how his 2 bodyguards positioned themselves near the door, not to protect their boss, but to block the exit. He watched the eyes of the 3 operators, who had already made their decision before Sal finished his first sentence. It was Sal who saw him first. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing at Calvin with his chin. No one answered right away. Sal repeated the question, this time in the tone he used when he wanted someone to remember he had 2 men at the door. "The kid, the one in the back." "Who is he?" "That's Calvin," one of the operators said. He was Bumpy's protege. Sal looked at him for a moment. A skinny 19-year-old kid, white shirt, dark pants, no jewelry, no bodyguard, nothing that gave him visible weight in that room. Sal smiled. Not a friendly smile. A smile from a man who had just found something he could use. "Bumpy's little orphan," he said out loud, so everyone could hear. How poetic. "And what's the little orphan doing here, at an adults' meeting?" Calvin didn't answer. His eyes didn't leave Sal. That look, Bumpy had taught it to him. Not aggressive, not fearful, simply present, completely present. It was the look that said he was reading every word before it left the mouth. Sal didn't know what to do with that look. Men who don't react to contempt are harder to handle than those who fight. Sal preferred the fight. The fight was predictable. That calm was not. "Sal," one of the bodyguards said quietly, "let's leave him." But Sal Caruso was the kind of man who mistakes silence for weakness, and in that confusion lies the origin of all the disasters that follow. He got up from the chair, crossed the room, stood in front of Calvin with his 110 kilos, and the ring on every finger and the smell of Brill cream and arrogance. He looked down at him, because he had 15 centimeters more height. "Your godfather is dead, kid, and you're nobody here." And then he did something no one in that room would ever forget. He reached out, grabbed Calvin by the collar of his shirt, and pushed him toward the door. Calvin fell backward. His heels hit the threshold. The Teresa stairs were 10, ancient marble, worn by decades of footsteps. Calvin fell down 7 of them before grabbing the handrail with his right hand and stopping the fall. He stayed there, half hanging, looking up. Sal Caruso stood at the top of the stairs, fists on his hips, satisfied with what he had done. His bodyguards looked away. The 3 Harlem operators watched from their seats, without moving, without intervening, without saying anything. Calvin stood up, brushed off his clothes, ran his hand over his face, and left. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He walked down 125th Street with the same step he always used, the step Bumpy had taught him, that of a man who knows exactly where he's going, even if no one else knows it yet. Sal Caruso went back up to the meeting room, poured himself a glass of water, and continued the meeting as if nothing had happened. That afternoon, he closed preliminary agreements with 2 of the 3 operators. The third, an older man named Duke Erskine, who had worked with Bumpy for 20 years, politely excused himself, put on his hat, and left without signing anything. Sal didn't give it any importance. Harlem was his. The little orphan was nobody. The meeting had been a success. That night, Calvin Reeves didn't sleep. He didn't sleep because he didn't have time to sleep. Harlem at night was a different organism from the day, with its own currents, its own loyalties, its own channels of information that ran parallel to the ones the Italians thought they controlled. Calvin knew those channels better than anyone. He had learned them following Bumpy for 10 years, carrying messages, listening to conversations, memorizing names and debts and favors and fears. In the first 12 hours after the Teresa stairs, Calvin made 43 visits. Some lasted 5 minutes, others lasted less. He went to the shoeshine man on 116th, to the barber on 121st, to the pharmacist on 127th, whom everyone knew was Duke Erskine's trusted man. He went to see Mrs. Thelma Patterson, who was 70 years old and had a perfect memory, and who for 30 years had kept Bumpy's accounting books in a spiral notebook she hid behind a Bible. He went to see 3 men who had been in prison with friends of Sal Caruso, and who came out with information you don't get from reading newspapers. Calvin didn't ask for favors. Bumpy had taught him that favors create debt, and debt creates dependence. Calvin offered something more valuable: information. Each person he visited left and the next one arrived, and Calvin listened, accumulated, connected. His mind worked the way Bumpy had told him his own worked, like a camera that never stopped recording. What he found in those 12 hours was not only that Sal Caruso wanted to control Harlem's numbers, it was that the Caruso family had 3 open debts with the Bonanno family that they were using Harlem money to cover. It was that Don Aldo Caruso had a health problem his family was hiding, and that 2 of his older sons were already fighting over the inheritance before the old man even finished dying. It was that Sal Caruso, specifically, had embezzled $40,000 from the family in the last 2 years using a ghost business in Queens, and that 2 people in that family already knew it and were waiting for the right moment to use it. And it was that Sal Caruso had a 23-year-old son, Marco, who wanted nothing to do with his father's business, who was studying accounting at Fordham University, who had a carefully constructed legitimate future, and that future depended entirely on the Caruso name remaining respectable. 18 hours after rolling down the Teresa steps, Calvin had everything he needed. He didn't need a weapon. He didn't need men. He needed exactly what Bumpy had taught him he always had: open eyes and the patience of someone who knows the right moment always comes. At 36 hours, he contacted Don Aldo directly. Not through intermediaries, not through encrypted street language messages. Directly. A phone call to the private number that only 3 people outside the Caruso family had saved. A number Calvin had because Bumpy had it, and Bumpy had left it written on a folded paper inside an envelope with his name, along with the phrase, "For when you need it, and you will need it." Donaldo answered on the third ring. Calvin spoke for 4 minutes. He never threatened. He never raised his voice. He described with clinical precision what he knew about the family's debts to the Bonanos, what he knew about Sal's embezzlement, and what he knew about the exact circumstances under which that information could reach the wrong ears. Then he mentioned Marco. Not as a threat, he repeated afterward, in perfect English. As a reality everyone wants to avoid. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that is not absence of words, but presence of understanding. Donaldo said 3 words, "Come tomorrow, noon." Exactly 48 hours after being pushed down the Teresa stairs, Calvin Reeves walked into an Italian bakery in the Bronx, 187th Street, the same bakery where the Caruso family had been celebrating their baptisms and funerals for 40 years. They were waiting for him at a table in the back. Donaldo Caruso, his eldest son Gino, and Sal. Sal wasn't wearing rings that morning. Calvin sat down. He declined the coffee they offered him, and he listened to what Donaldo had to say, which was, in essence, an apology in Sicilian suit, without the word apology ever being spoken, but with all the elements that make one. Sal had acted without consulting. Sal had been reckless. Sal would rectify. The agreements he had signed with the Harlem operators would be void. The neighborhood's business would continue exactly as it had under Johnson. The Caruso family would stay out of Harlem, completely. Calvin listened to everything. He nodded once. He stood up. Before leaving, he stopped next to Sal Caruso. He didn't look at him with anger. He looked at him the same way Bumpy looked at everything, with a calm that was more unsettling than any threat. And he said to him in a low voice, so low that only Sal could hear it, "Bumpy taught me that a real man never needs to push anyone. If you have to push, you've already lost." Sal didn't answer anything. He had nothing to answer. Calvin left the bakery. He walked 4 blocks alone, hands in his pockets, along the Bronx sidewalks, which weren't his land, but that day he walked them without looking back. He thought about Bumpy. He thought about the night he found him sleeping in the dry cleaner's doorway, with broken shoes and the mark on his arm, without history, without a name worth anything, without anything except wide-open eyes. He thought about 10 years of lessons that didn't come from books, but from watching a man who knew exactly how the world worked. The world doesn't work with force. The world works with information. The world works with patience. The world works with the willingness to see what is there, available to anyone willing to look at it without fear and without hurry. Bumpy had taught him all that without teaching him anything directly. He taught it by taking him to meetings where he didn't say a word. He taught it by asking him to observe, and then asking, "What did you see?" He taught it with the way he solved problems, not with violence, but with such deep understanding of the situation that violence became unnecessary because the other side had already lost before the fight began. In the Harlem fleet, on the boat, Duke Erskine knew what had happened before Calvin returned to tell anything. In Harlem, important news travels before people do. Duke went to Calvin's apartment that night with a bottle of bourbon they didn't open and 2 glasses they didn't use, and they sat in silence in the small living room where Bumpy had spent many afternoons. And Duke eventually said, "The old man knew what he was doing when he chose you." Calvin didn't answer anything. He looked out the window toward 127th Street, where the city continued its usual movement, indifferent and perpetual. He thought that somewhere in that movement there was a boy sleeping in a doorway who still didn't know someone was going to find him. He thought that Bumpy had done that for him. He thought it was a kind of debt that isn't paid with money. The story of what happened in those 48 hours spread through Harlem the way truly important stories spread, without exaggeration, without embellishment, mouth to mouth, in the barber shop, in the pharmacy, on the corners where men played dominoes under the red awnings. The story didn't say that Calvin had won a fight. It said something different. It said that Bumpy Johnson had chosen well, that the truly dangerous man doesn't prove it with his fists, but with his mind, that the boy nobody remembered, the one who had no name of his own but only a borrowed title, had done in 48 hours what many men couldn't do in years. And he had done it exactly the way Bumpy would have wanted it done, without a single drop of blood, without a single raised voice, without anything the world could call a crime, because true power never needs to get dirty to prove itself. Sal Caruso returned to the Bronx that same week. He didn't come back to Harlem. He never came back. Donaldo died the following March. Marco Caruso graduated from Fordham, got a job at an accounting firm in Manhattan, and led a completely upright life without his surname causing him any trouble, just as Calvin had implied would be possible if things were handled the right way. And Calvin Reeves stayed in Harlem. He kept being the godson, even though there was no longer a godfather. He kept watching meetings from the corners, listening to what wasn't said, reading people in 3 seconds, accumulating the information that is the only kind of power no one can take from your hands. Bumpy Johnson was dead, but Harlem had someone to look after it, and that, as always, was enough.